Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on the 1918 influenza pandemic. I am just going to get it ready for you. Okay, now, all right. By the way, if none of you recognize what I'm wearing, it's the best pandemic clothes ever. It's called a dishdasha. That's what we call it in Iraq, thobe in Saudi Arabia. Yeah, basically what the Arab oil sheiks wear, and I'm not an oil sheik, but I am comfortable. And this is, yeah, not exactly a pajama. We technically in our culture go to work with this, but more comfortable in my opinion than a pajama, okay. So here we go. Okay, the important part of this lecture, number one, is the midterm is approaching. So I am going to start now doing a good amount of reviewing for the midterm. And it goes back also now to our history of philosophy, our philosophy of history. You've probably often heard the phrase that those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it, or that, well, the problem with historians have with that phrase is it's overly deterministic, suggesting that if it happened in the past, it's going to happen again in the present or future based on what happened in the past. Really, the philosophy of history in this case is we study the history of past pandemics, and we're going to see a lot of similarities. On that level, this is really, in one sense, a history of science, how science has evolved. At the end of the day, that's all what these lectures are. But there's also something else. What can history teach us? Not that it repeats, but that there are some commonalities to the human condition. Okay? The trauma, the pain about losing a loved one to an invisible force. Well, that resonates with the present. And that's what I want you to appreciate from this last great pandemic, the 1918 pandemic, almost a century ago. So what we're going to do is first look at the primary sources. And with primary sources, what do we want to interrogate is what is modern in these primary sources? Why are they significant for our world history? Okay. So we have to realize the date is September 1918. The flu virus had probably emerged during the flu season, and it was just like any other flu season. By September, though, and this is what made it an unusual flu season, it had evolved, had mutated into a strain that was much deadlier. Okay. Remember, in terms of what is the importance of pandemics for history, pandemics usually spread due to two phenomena, both involve mass. And remember the word mass? That's going to be essential for you to understand modernity. Okay. In other words, either it's due to trade over mass distances, or it's due to war, which requires the mobilization of the masses. And World War I mobilized masses like no war in history in terms of the numbers of people who are fighting. So it's not unusual that the virus would be particularly virulent, so it would go viral in a military camp. After all, during wartime, you have masses of people huddled together in confined spaces that you would normally not have during peacetime. Think of military barracks. Think of a group of people training in close proximity. It's very hard to train for the military while social distancing. So what do we see here? I want you to pay attention to this. This is Camp Devens near Boston. And what is this doctor saying? Okay. It had about 50,000 men, or did have, very ominous before this pandemic broke loose. So 50,000 men, that's a population of a city, okay, confined in these military quarters. And now look what he is saying. The men come in with the typical symptoms of a flu, but then they start to develop a very rapid pneumonia. Okay? And remember now, pneumonias are usually caused by bacteria. And so while the flu virus, what it does, it enters the human body, the immune system overreacts to kill that virus. And in the process makes it weak and susceptible to a bacterial infection, usually causing pneumonia. Now look at this. They develop mahogany spots over their cheeks, and then you can see cyanosis, okay, which is just basically a blackening to the face. Now, if you look at the sentence, it's hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. Well, what modern ism have we studied that would explain that comment? That's racist. That is just your old-fashioned racism. Which was quite prevalent, not just in the American South, but we see here in the North. Okay. It's only a few hours, then death comes. They suffocate. And that's usually what happens with a pneumonia is it causes your lungs to more or less kind of drown in water. Okay, so you drown in your own fluids. The immune reaction is more or less, at the end of the day, just liquefies your lungs. Now, if we go look at this, you see 1 man, 2 men die according to this doctor, and then 20, okay, so that they start dropping like flies. Okay. We have been averaging about 100 deaths per day, okay, and taking up, now a lot of these terms I underlined, don't worry if you don't understand them. All you need to get is this virus is causing pneumonia, and then that when pneumonia comes, it means death. There is a modern medicine that has yet to be invented yet, and that is antibiotics. So you see, you take antibiotics to treat bacterial infections. And that's, since they have yet to be invented, that's why so many people are dying. And if you think about it, that's also the reason why ventilators are so much in demand. And ventilators help you breathe when that happens to your lungs, when your lungs liquefy. Okay, this is always a problem with the deceased, whether we're talking about the Black Death of the mid-1300s, to this pandemic, to the current this current COVID pandemic, how to take care of the deceased. In this case, what did? They had to use special trains to carry away the deceased. And this is always a problem, whether it was whether it was during the mid-1300s and the Black Death, or all the way until 1980, you could not create enough coffins to keep up with demands. So what you saw were just kind of dead bodies laid out in long rows. And these guys who would have come from the fields of France fighting on the trenches in World War I, that was deadly modern warfare. But still, they would have not seen the rate of fatalities, according to this doctor, that they actually saw during wartime. And remember in the very beginning of this lecture, what I said, this pandemic would end up killing more people than World War I and World War II combined, which was a much more deadlier, more modern conflict. And here you get an idea. So Camp Devens, remember, is outside of Boston. So here you see how the soldiers have to be treated. This is not a real hospital. It's a makeshift hospital, okay? All these soldiers. So now where are they getting infected? So there's a couple of vectors. Number one, the disease, even though we call it the Spanish flu, most likely originated in the US. Then what happened? You had massive amount of troops moving to the European front, spreading it there, and then of course, bringing it back. Okay. So if you're a soldier on a returning ship, remember there aren't planes back then to carry massive amount of soldiers. You're on a ship for a long time with somebody who's infected. By the time that ship arrives, the entire ship is infected. In other words, so these masses of soldiers who are being affected got sick on the way coming home. If not that, then they got affected while stationed in the military camp. Either way, war breeds disease. So you see at Camp Devens, then, who is it that makes the masks? Now, remember, the modern factory system as we know it is not as developed back then. But furthermore, if there are factories, most of them are devoted to making military munitions, bullets, artillery shells, because this is a war of mass production. So it's volunteers of the Red Cross. They're the ones who would basically by hand. This is pre-modern. They are just more or less making masks as much as one hand can make in a sitting. And if we look at another military base, Camp Beauregard, and remember what I said always, this military bases are breeding grounds for diseases. You could see when that deadly strain emerged in September, just how much the rates skyrocketed around that time. Here is another military camp where you can just see the amount of soldiers who are just kind of laid low because of the virus. Now, here we have the testimony of a nurse. And what did she say? In her case, she was at the officer barracks, so probably nothing like this. The officers probably got their own quarters, okay? But what did she witness? Two of the married officers who are on their deathbed call for their wives in their final moments. And what happens? Finally, when the first one died, what did she do? She went to the nurses' quarters and cried it out. History doesn't repeat itself, but what did I say? History tells us something of kind of the human condition. The psychological trauma then was just as, well, traumatic as it is now, particularly for the nurses. And so when we think about this, this is a problem for mental health. The mental health of the front care workers was an issue then and is an issue now. The only difference was more than 100 years ago, mental health as we know it hadn't yet to develop. The whole idea of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, didn't exist. When the soldiers came back with PTSD, they just thought this was some kind of shock for being exposed to too many artillery shells. It was called shell shock. So that just gives you an idea. If they can't even diagnose soldiers with PTSD, what about people in peacetime, the nurses, who have gone through just as much trauma? We could say this nurse definitely would have suffered from PTSD as a result of witnessing all these deaths. And like we said, we have plenty of World War I films, 1917, for example. We have plenty of World War II films, but like I said, there's plenty of, we all know Saving Private Ryan. There is no film dedicated to this woman called Saving Private Nurse Ryan. I don't even know if that's her name, just to make my point. Okay, now let's look at this case. Remember I said the military bases are breeding grounds for diseases, and it's only a matter of time. Because think about it, who keeps these bases running? A lot of times you need civilians to go onto the base, bring food, supplies, so on and so forth, and then the civilians leave. And when they leave, they start spreading it amongst the civilian population. And in this case, here is a family that was, one family was particularly lucky. None of them were affected or infected, I should say. But here she describes the memories of the neighbor who had lost their young boy. Okay. And again, now remember what the doctor previously said. Back then, there was not enough capacity to mass produce coffins. There was just no modern system to keep the coffins in the supply to meet the demand. So what does this poor parent scream when she sees her boy being wrapped up in a cloth? Don't take him away like that, in the kind of hysteria. said, put them in the macaroni box. So when you think macaroni, you probably think of that nasty thing called mac and cheese, which comes in the little blue box. Now, having said that, that's what I grew up on, but nonetheless, I guess macaroni boxes were much bigger and sturdier in those days. And so this is what she's saying in her final moments. At least let me put my boy in a macaroni box. Or what about this case of a woman? So 2008 and 1918, she would have been barely one. So she's 80 when she's giving this account of her father who got infected and was delirious. And upon hearing this, at this point, this woman who was a baby crying, thought it was a wild cat and picked up the baby, thinking it was the cat and about to throw it in the fireplace. What an awful, even if it's a wild cat, that's even a mean thing to do. But anyway, there were animal rights really didn't exist back then. And yeah, basically the mom saved the day from this, from the father making this baby kebab in the fire. Look at this newspaper. What is modern about this newspaper? Number one, any newspaper is mass produced, even if it's a small newspaper in Madison, Wisconsin, called the Wasau Daily. It's still mass produced. And what is happening here? Okay, so let's look at the first level. Woodrow Wilson, as a result of the war effort, is not acknowledging this disease as a problem, censoring, more or less, preventing the mass media from really properly addressing the severity of the disease. Look if this sounds familiar. With little direction from DC, state and local officials more or less developed an ad hoc strategy to deal with this pandemic. Okay, and of course, that does sound familiar with how the US initially dealt with COVID-19. So who are they quoting? Now, a health officer is a very modern position. Because think during the Black Death or prior to that, let's say the Augustinian plague or even the plague of Athens, there was really no such thing as health officers, people whose full-time job was to take care of the health of the masses. Public health, replace the word public with mass, and there you get mass health. You get the idea, this is a very modern concept, that there should be a permanent set of bureaucrats who deal with public health, making sure the masses are healthy. What is this public health officer calling for? To wear masks. Again, sounds familiar. And also reassuring the public that the supply will be met, and more or less calling for the masses to volunteer with the Red Cross at the YMCA to help in their making. Because again, that's a pre-modern method of dealing with this necessity of masks during this crisis. And so here we go from whether it's Madison, Wisconsin to San Francisco. Again, we see the volunteers that are so crucial to this effort. Now, like I said, the federal government wasn't coordinating. It wasn't also delivering enough financial support to deal with this. And if this sounds familiar, think how hard it was for Congress to pass a COVID stimulus bill. Now, back then, they called it the Spanish influenza. And that there's a reason for that. It was only in Spain because Spain was not a party to World War I. It was only in Spain that the mass media was allowed to report on the pandemic. Okay, so here, see here, the Public Health Service, again, a very modern body, didn't really exist in the pre-modern times. So what is Congress going to do to help the Public Health Service? This is the precursor to the CDC, okay? To give them support, to help the state and local boards of health. Again, very modern. Boards of health. Remember that very video a long time ago I showed you about the plague. Boards of health emerged as a result of the Black Death, and they evolved into their modern manifestation. Boards of health dedicated full-time to maintaining the health of the masses. And what is the money for? Okay. Personnel, they have to be paid. hospital supplies, transportation, and they gave about $1 million. Now look at this city which cautiously lifts its quarantine, and this was a problem for any location, was when to lift quarantine. So by mid-November, the cases were starting to drop. So if we go to Pullman, Washington, small town, and I can tell you it's small, I've been there, there's a University of Washington, Pullman. How do you appeal to get the citizens to be careful? To their patriotic side. And patriotism is modern. It's just a kind of on the spectrum of nationalism. It is a form of the masses loyal to the state instead of their pre-modern loyalties to family or religion. Now, you could be loyal to all three, family, religion, and state, but your loyalty to the state is modern. Your loyalty to the family and religion are pre-modern because it's, the family and faith has been around since time immemorial. Okay. Now, here he's referring to the Kaiser who was defeated recently. Now look at the date, November 15th, who was defeated 4 days prior. The First World War ended on November 11th at 11 a.m. And that's why in the US, there is a Veterans Day on that day. It is to commemorate the end of World War I on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So a third wave would eventually emerge in the spring of 1919, but this is now basically lifting the lockdown, okay? The ban is going to be lifted, but there's still a danger. Okay? And remember the warning from public health officials as regulations were relaxed towards June of 2020 when the rate started to drop, okay? Do not give the Kaiser, or that is the military, the ruler of Germany, any benefit from infecting our population. The word Kaiser in German comes from just the old Latin word for Caesar, by the way. Okay. Now, what are issues, what are institutions that were a problem to maintain now, as they were back then? Places of worship, church. And again, look at this. This is advice that we would see today. If you're not feeling well, make sure you stay home. The schools, okay, it's an issue now, was an issue back then. Now, churches are pre-modern institutions, right? As I said, with faith. Schools, on the other hand, that the masses of children between the age of 6 to 18 are to be educated. That's a very modern idea. Okay. And again, the same advice. Your kids are sick, keep them at home. Theater, lodges, and pool rooms, well, those are where the masses entertain themselves. Okay. Theaters are a modern institution. They did not exist in pre-modern times. Okay. And here we see kind of the issues of, once the schools open, how did the kids have to go to school? Again, of course, wearing masks. Okay. And then this could be in an exam image. And what's the importance of the exam image is just you get an idea. The red X means those who deceased. And if you just look at the dates, okay, this is all around January 6th, January 4th, all these people are, dead, have died as a result of this pandemic. It is December 26th. Look at the date, let's look here. Thursday, December 26, 1918. So let's learn how to read this. That's the day they were most likely admitted. And then if we look at Jake Griffin, just under the line, when did he die? About 3 days later. Okay. Then somebody named Otis died on January 7th. And so, yeah, this is what we have, a register of the masses of death. Political cartoons from those days, probably an image you would recognize now, that of the Grim Reaper. And now look at this image. Okay. Why, and look at the reference to the poison gas shell, which we looked at in the previous documentary. Why is it bad? Because this disease menaces war production or war mass production. You see it in this public service announcement. You see it in the same here. Okay. What's the danger of the Spanish flu? It hurts the war effort. Okay. Again, still using the word Spanish influenza. And what is it calling for? Don't spit. And that's why spitting is frowned upon in today's polite society, because it has this connection with spreading disease. And sure enough, spitting does spread disease. Again, look at this political cartoon, replace the word the public on his hat with the masses. And you can see this is a modern cartoon to deal with modern public health. You would see these signs on train cars. And the same issue you have today with back then. Some people just refuse to mask, and that's why he is not being allowed to board this train car. Here we could just see other attempts to take care of influenza patients. It was thought, putting them outside to get fresh air would help. And it did help. Fresh air would have exposed you to the sun, which gives you vitamin D. It would have helped the nurses not get infected at the end of the day. And here you could see the kind of makeshift hospitals, because what was a problem back then as it is now? Keeping up with the demand of hospital beds and space. Modern institutions such as the police still had to keep on working. But you see still the law was maintained. They were wearing masks, as well as the courts, where here we see a police officer giving his testimony. Why are these guys not wearing masks? I see none of them. Okay, anyway, just realized that. And the same issues of children going to school. Here we see Japanese school children. In other words, we focused on the US, but this picture also reminds us that what we looked at in the US, it was really a global issue back then. Okay, so now let's look at the secondary sources. The following. What is Jeremy Brown saying? Again, the limitations of the parallels we draw between 1918 with 2020. Like I said, history doesn't repeat, but can teach us a lot about the human condition. What is Jeremy Brown reminding us? And number one, what did I say about pneumonia? Okay. It was deadly, that disease, because there were no antibiotics. Today, antibiotics are mass produced, and hence, with the mass production of antibiotics, the death rate, the mass death, is much lower than normally would be. Okay. COVID would have been a lot more deadlier without any antibiotics. Modern medicine hadn't evolved because up until this point, remember, the human eye has yet to see what a virus is. In fact, they really thought the Spanish influenza was caused by a bacterium back then. Now what do we have? Modern hospitals. What makes hospitals modern? Well, number one, they benefit from modern science. You have intensive care units that could provide ventilators, for example. Modern medicine, modern notions of sterilization, all of that is really important. Okay. But we still use pre-modern or well, you could say low-tech measures. Such as keeping a distance. That's low tech. Now, look at this article where yours truly is being quoted. Okay. Remember what I said, war spreads disease? Look at this fatal mistake of holding a parade for the returning soldiers to sell war bonds. And how are war bonds modern? War bonds work like this. Basically, the government is depending on the masses to subsidize the war, because taxes during modern warfare is not enough to cover it. You could raise taxes still, that's not enough to finance warfare in the modern era. You need the public to willingly give money to the government, with the government promising we will pay it back with interest. So what's a great way to raise war bonds? Have a parade with soldiers to aroused the patriotism, another modern phenomenon, of the spectators. And that was what we could call today a super spreading event. That was in Philadelphia. Now, if we look at this article, look at how it gives you a good overview of the science. Unlike COVID, COVID does mutate. We talk about various variants, but not as fast as the flu virus. And the flu virus is not a coronavirus. It's not, it has a completely different shape. So what happened to the Spanish flu? Well, it didn't go anywhere. It just remained in circulation. It just evolved to become less deadlier and evolved until 1957. And so what happened between 1918 to 1957? Well, those who got killed were killed, and the rest of the human population just developed an immunity. The body recognized it, so it wasn't as deadly. And then in 1957, what happened? It made a shift. It swapped out 3 of its 8 gene segments for a different strain. Now, its gene segments, we usually refer to just 2 of those gene segments with the letter H and N. Okay. And then what happened in 1968? More swapping occurred, and that's why it's called H3N2. Okay, in other words, what was the 1957 strain? It's pretty simple. It would have been called H2N2. Okay, and that's how we named the various strains. Okay, and then what happened? The H1N1 virus that caused the 1918 pandemic also mutated. It came back in 1977 after what? Perhaps being accidentally released from a lab. And you wonder why so many people believe that COVID-19 either was a biological weapon, save that, we'll talk about that for later. But lab accidents do happen, and there you go. Okay, it was accidentally released from a lab, took on new gene segments. Okay. And yeah. So there we go. And then, of course, when we're talking about the H1N1 swine flu outbreak of 2009, that is the old strain that's reemerging again. Now we get to the politics. How do we make even 1918, a year, 100 years ago, political? The image there is referring to Trump's request to delay the elections as a result of COVID-19. Now we're going to watch a video that deals with how this virus can take on polemical dimensions. And before I do that, hold on. Before I do that, just to kind of just conclude with another slide before we do that. This is amazing. 1 child has died of flu this flu season. Okay. Look at the previous deaths. Okay, and what is this showing us? Is the following. You see, when we wear masks and go out masked, it's not only do we prevent COVID from spreading, we prevent the influenza virus from spreading as well. Okay. So here now I'm going to show this video. Sorry. Okay, and that ends our lecture, and thank you.